So how is the off-grid solar industry faring? Obviously, the industry was hit pretty hard by COVID, bounced back pretty fast and they catch up, but global challenges over the last couple of years have caused a heavy stagnation in the industry. I'd like to bring your attention to the little blue line at the bottom. That's West Africa. West Africa, although not historically one of the main markets for our industry, has actually grown significantly faster than East Africa or South Asia, driven mostly by Nigeria, but also markets like Togo, Benin, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and sales in the region. Pardon, monsieur l'interprète. Yeah, so sales across the West African region have doubled over the last 5 years, basically. So what are the challenges that the industry has been facing? And this is not specific to off-grid solar, right? Over the last couple of years, we've seen currency depreciations and devaluations that have affected companies' earnings in local currencies while their obligations are in hard currencies. We've seen soaring inflation across most countries in the continent, affecting customers' ability to pay, and we are talking about some of the poorest customers. And finally, interest rate hikes to combat inflation. And this piles up on top of the original challenge. I think this is one of the key things that we take away from the last market trends report, is that only about a quarter of households can afford the cheapest energy access solution, which is a pay-as-you-go tier 1 solar home system. Maybe at a stretch, another 27 could reach it. But this means that most of the unelectrified households right now cannot afford what is basically the cheapest electrification or pre-electrification solution. That's because the vast majority of them live in fragile conflict or violence affected areas or very remote regions. And not only are they amongst the poorest customers, but actually reaching them is at a premium. So the estimation is that when the product reaches these customers, it's actually 57% more expensive than it would be in a peri-urban area, let's say, or in a major market. So where does that leave us? So essentially, my message is that it's not going to be easy, but there is opportunity to move the needle. As the off-grid solar industry, we are keen to see all stakeholders come together to help us deliver on these goals. Governments to help support the private sector, where the private sector is helping to deliver development goals. Development partners to support this through grants and subsidies, and to help de-risk the field for private sector investors. But obviously, we also want companies in our sector to improve their performance and also go beyond the current business models, which, as I said before, will not be sufficient to reach the hardest to reach. And actually, it's great that we have Moon on the panel today, one of our members, who will be able to talk to us about energy as a service, which I think they're spearheading, and it's a really innovative and interesting new way to look at delivering to the hardest to reach. And finally, to end on a positive note, the technologies that we need exist. We've seen successful public interventions to encourage electrification through the private sector. And right now with M300, which I'm sure Andy will talk about, with the World Bank and African Development Bank providing leadership, there's a huge opportunity for us to jump on the bandwagon. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Oliver. So rather than hear from me, I thought it would be good to hear directly from our colleagues at the World Bank and the African Development Bank a little bit about Mission 300 and what they're doing. I'd just like to ask each of the panelists, just to save time since we have so many speakers, just please introduce yourselves. I'll point to you and I'll call on you and give you a short introduction on yourself, and then you can respond to the question. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Jan Koppen, who's the lead energy specialist at the World Bank Group. To talk a little bit about what the World Bank is doing to help smaller African countries attract distributed renewable energy investment.
Sure, so you already introduced me, so it saves some time. The question is a really important one because it was already mentioned in the introductory presentation that we don't only have an access problem, we also have a concentration problem, right? And that concentration problem actually also applies in terms of private sector investment. It's not like there is no private sector in DRE today. There's actually, we've just started at the World Bank to ask ourselves, so if we want to get to 300 million, right? Assuming the money is there, what are the companies that we actually will depend on to deliver? And then so we did a survey that's still not published, and hopefully sometime next year we'll publish it. but that was surprisingly encouraging. So we actually noticed that across Africa, for example, there are over 500 companies already active in the DRE space. And even if you extrapolate the jobs created from that, there are almost 400,000 jobs already created in Africa within the DRE sector. The problem is that these jobs and these companies are very concentrated on very few countries. And so it's not surprising. I mean, in East Africa, that's mostly Kenya and Uganda, and in West Africa, guess what? It's mostly Nigeria. And so there's a huge problem with the smaller countries.
But why do you think there's that concentration?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are tons of reasons for this, but of course the key reason from the perspective of the private sector is the economies of scale. The opportunity has to be in line with the transaction costs and the market barriers, right? So in every single country in West Africa, and this is also a problem, you have completely different, especially for mini-grid operators, very different regulatory frameworks. So to wrap your head around how to actually scale mini-grids, for example, in a given country takes some time. Then you have to establish a local presence, you have to train staff, etc. And so there's a much bigger commercial argument to do that when you have a much bigger market. And so a lot of the smaller, more fragile countries need a completely different operating model, not only from the private sector, but also from the public sector, to deliver incentives and new operating and implementation models that cater to these smaller markets.
Great, thanks. I'm going to come back to you because I have a lot of questions about it here. But I'm going to turn to Alex Owusu Ansah, who's the Chief Regional Power Markets Expert from the African Development Bank, just to talk a little bit about the AFDB's financing mechanisms and how those are going to be deployed differently to advance Mission 300's goals.
Thank you very much. The bank has been involved in moving DRs forward, basically through grant financing. If you've heard about CIFA windows, Sustainable Energy for Africa, they have been spearheading the deployment of mini-grids and off-grids, normally through concessional lending, not to private people, but often to governments. And what we are focusing on is how we can bring in blended financing, bring in concessional financing, which the private sector, who often would have to borrow from commercial rates, blend their financing with concessional financing that we give to governments and allow them to reduce their cost of capital. We also do direct grant to institutions such as Jeff's Group, grant financing for companies that are operating in the DR space. And also we do, apart from the grants and the concessional financing, we do on lending, lending to commercial banks within the countries involved. So commercial banks can on-lend to specific sectors. So for energy and the DR sector, we have an operation, for instance, in Nigeria, where a project we call the Nigerian Electrification Project, where they are targeting over 250,000 homes with mini-grids and off-grids. And the approach is for them to use what they call the minimum subsidy tender, where the providers would tender to provide the service within a locality. 7 states are involved in Nigeria. The provider will tender, and then once the evaluation is done and we select the minimum tender, we give them the subsidy to be able to bring them there. Basically, I think for the private sector, the major hurdle is the cost of capital, how much they have to invest to deliver a service. The bank's effort primarily is to see how can we reduce the cost of capital for the private sector. Besides that, somebody spoke about the regulatory environment in the countries. Most of these countries have not defined clearly what the regulations are with respect to DAR deployment. So we have a department that is working with the countries to come up with a harmonized regulatory frameworks for most of the African countries, so the markets would have some kind of uniformity by standardizing the regulations across the countries and allowing the private sector to know exactly what they are going for when they enter into any specific market.
What's African Development Bank doing differently to accelerate the pace at which it's going to advance electrical connections compared to what it's done in the past? What's new about it?
Well, the activities of CEFA is fairly new. They are trying to scale up the volumes of the financing that, if you look at our last year report, it looks like we put more money in renewable energy projects on the continent than in conventional energy.
So it's more money, and it's the type of money also that you're making available, more concessional?
We are making available more concessional funding, and we are raising the volumes of money that we put into renewable and distributed energy systems.
Great, thanks. Aminata, I'm going to turn to you. So Aminata Bokarba is the TBI Senior Energy Advisor to the Minister of the Ministry of Mines and Energy Resources here in Togo. Aminata, can you bring it down to the country level for us? What is the place of off-grid in Togo, and what models have been put in place to advance off-grid connections? We just saw from Oliver's presentation that at least half of the electrical connections are going to have to come from off-grid. And we've also seen that, 88% of the people who don't have access to electricity cannot even afford Tier 1 access. So how are we going to do this at the country level? What do you need from a Togolese standpoint?
Okay, je vais me permettre de parler en français.
Oui.
Merci Andy. Donc le Togo a posé des objectifs très ambitieux en termes d'accès à l'énergie, avec notamment 3 objectifs principaux. Le premier, c'est d'atteindre l'accès universel en 2030. Le deuxième, c'est de réduire le taux de dépendance aux importations. Le troisième, c'est d'avoir les 50% de renouvelables dans le mix énergétique. Actuellement, nous sommes à près de 70% du taux d'accès et le off-grid représente près de 10% dans ces 70%. Ce qui veut dire que c'est un secteur qui est très important pour le Togo. Et pour cela, le Togo a mis en place un modèle unique de distribution de kits solaires, qui est le programme CISO, qui est un programme qui avait pour objectif d'électrifier 550 000 ménages en 5 ans. Actuellement, on est à près de 250 000 ménages en kits solaires. Donc, le gouvernement togolais a mis en place un programme de subvention directement du budget de l'État pour subventionner l'acquisition des kits sur une durée de 3 ans. Donc, chaque ménage actuellement au Togo, dans le milieu rural, a droit à 72 000 francs sur 3 ans pour obtenir un kit solaire. Donc, l'État a mis en place un programme de recrutement d'opérateurs où nous avons 4 opérateurs qui distribuent les kits, dont Moon, B-Box, Sun King et Solergy. Donc, ces 4 ont des exonérations fiscales et bénéficient aussi indirectement de la subvention. Donc, ce chèque CISO a vraiment permis d'accélérer la distribution des kits au Togo.
Great, thank you. Great, I want to get a private sector perspective on this effort. So we're going to turn to Thomas Samuel, who is the president of Suna Design and Moon, and who's been working in the off-grid space for quite some time. So why don't you share with us of your perspectives on this, giving some examples of successful financial models that you've seen actually work to leverage and deliver off-grid energy.
Merci Andy. Je vais parler en français aussi. J'étais exactement à la même position il y a 7 ans, je crois, ou 2017, quand le Togo a lancé sa stratégie d'électrification universelle, exactement dans la même salle, avec le le lancement de la vision du président togolais de faire un premier pays où ils atteignent l'accès universel. C'était à l'époque absolument unique, avec 3 composantes, extension de réseau, mini-réseau et kit solaire. Aminata a décrit le projet CISO. Aujourd'hui, ça paraît logique que les États subventionnent les foyers les plus vulnérables. À l'époque, c'était complètement nouveau et le Togo avait pris un leadership très important. Aminata a dit que c'était presque un demi-million de personnes qui devaient être équipées de kits solaires à l'époque, selon cette stratégie. Mais le Togo s'est rendu compte que c'était à peu près 12 000 hameaux ou lieux d'habitation dans lesquels il fallait aussi de l'éclairage public. Et du coup, dans cette stratégie, et ça c'est le premier business model que l'on a réussi à prouver à l'échelle avec Suna Design, c'est l'équipement, la fourniture, l'installation et la maintenance de 50 000 lampadaires solaires pour le compte de la République togolaise. Donc on a un acheteur privé, un acheteur public, pardon, donc le Togo, qui bénéficie d'un financement du gouvernement français, donc un prêt du Trésor. Et du coup, nous, Suna Design, fabriquons en France, acheminons, faisons installer par des entreprises privées togolaises et assurons la maintenance pendant 12 ans. C'est un schéma qui n'a pas que des intérêts, mais en tout cas qui est bénéfique pour le secteur privé, qui a fait que nous avons réussi à créer de l'emploi au Togo, impacté des millions de Togolais ruraux avec un éclairage public de qualité qui apporte des intérêts économiques, sociaux et beaucoup de bienfaits. Et ça a été faisable rapidement. Et je pense que ça, c'est un des sujets qui est intéressant de ce business model. L'Export Finance nous a permis, en un peu moins de 3 ans, de contractualiser, d'exécuter. Et aujourd'hui, on peut dire que cette fin d'année, on aura installé ces 50 000 lampadaires solaires. C'est un projet d'à peu près 40 millions d'euros. C'est pas facile de délivrer un projet de cette taille aussi rapidement dans tout le Togo rural. Donc ça a été un premier business model hyper intéressant que l'on souhaite répliquer et étendre dans d'autres contextes, au Togo et aussi dans la sous-région. Et ça nous a donné aussi beaucoup d'idées pour complémenter les efforts d'accès universel. Et donc ça, je tourne ma casquette et je passe du côté Moon. Nous sommes ici opérateurs de kits solaires avec le schéma CISO. Nous bénéficions du coup d'un programme extrêmement bien structuré avec une subvention au client final et on se rend compte depuis les quelques années où nous opérons que l'on arrive à atteindre, et on est à peu près en ligne avec les statistiques, à peu près 50% de taux de pénétration dans les villages isolés. Une moitié de la population n'a, même si le kit est subventionné, pas les moyens de devenir propriétaire. Parce que devenir propriétaire, ça implique payer une mensualité régulière et beaucoup de ces habitants de zones rurales sont agriculteurs, ont des revenus non garantis et pas forcément réguliers. Et du coup, on est en train de développer des projets dans la sous-région et principalement, je pense que le premier exemple à l'échelle sera Madagascar, où on a un schéma qui ressemble initialement à un schéma d'acheteurs publics qui finance l'achat du CAPEX. Donc à la place d'acheter 50 000 lampadaires solaires, on achète 50 000 kits solaires. Donc ça peut être un acheteur public ou un acheteur privé. Et après, cet asset co, et en fonction des contextes et des réglementations, peut avoir plusieurs formes et structurations, va lancer l'installation et l'opération de ces kits solaires as a service. Et là, c'est ce qui me passionne en ce moment, c'est réussir, en plus d'avoir installé ces produits, de créer un business model soutenable, parce que le paiement des usagers, aussi modeste soit-il et aussi peu contraignant soit-il, parce qu'on ne force pas à payer, c'est vraiment du pay as you can plutôt que du pay as you go, va créer un flux de revenus qui va payer pour la maintenance des équipements et pour payer les emplois qui auront été créés en zone rurale. Donc c'est extrêmement vertueux et nous le promouvons avec grand bruit en ce moment.
What do you see as the tension between? You want to go ahead?
Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais rajouter aux 2 interventions. C'est Dami Pinou-Poku. Je suis le DG adjoint de la CEB. Et donc, j'ai été déjà ministre de l'énergie au Togo. Et donc, je voulais juste rajouter que la question de off-grid, d'amener le courant à nos populations hors réseau est né depuis plus d'une dizaine d'années, où on a constaté, étant un ancien de la CET, que dans nos milieux, il était très difficile d'amener le réseau dans toutes les maisons. Les habitats sont très dispersés et en plus, il y a une question de revenus de nos populations pour pouvoir payer mensuellement les consommations, sans compter que la société aussi d'électricité devait partir, relever les compteurs, faire la facturation, revenir. Ça faisait beaucoup de charges pour tout le monde. Et donc, l'électrification à travers de systèmes hors réseau était née, plus la volonté du chef de l'État de donner l'électricité à toute la population. Et ça nous a amené à ces projets dont CISO, on a parlé tout à l'heure. Alors, un des défis que nous avons aussi rencontrés quand on avait commencé, c'était la maintenance et l'entretien des équipements. Et donc, c'était un défi très important. Nous avions installé les lampadaires solaires et puis quelques temps après, il y avait quelques difficultés, 2-3 ans. Et ayant pris des leçons sur cela, le chef de l'État, le gouvernement, a décidé de créer une école de formation sur les énergies renouvelables, permettant ainsi d'avoir de la main-d'œuvre pour pouvoir d'abord poser les équipements et assurer l'entretien de ces équipements-là. Une société d'électricité classique, on avait la responsabilité d'amener le courant partout, mais force est de constater que, surtout dans nos milieux ruraux, il est difficile de le faire. Le secteur de l'électricité, quand même, est un secteur très capitalistique et la mise en place de systèmes hors réseau vient régler tant soit peu ces questions. Voilà ce que je voulais rajouter. Merci.
Thank you. And that was that was Damipi Nupoku, who's the Deputy Director General of the Communauté Électrique de Benin, and who has quite a lot of experience as a former minister as well here in Togo. I want to follow up with you, though. We see a lot of an increasing trend of countries deregulating and allowing the production of power by commercial and industrial clients, which means that sometimes the countries themselves are losing their best paying customers at a time when the utilities have tremendous pressure to connect the last mile customers. So they're losing their best paying customers, but they're being asked to add customers who often don't have the ability to pay. Do you have any thoughts and recommendations about how to navigate this tension? Sorry, I didn't prepare for that question in advance. But you did say ask you anything I wanted, right? That's for you.
Okay. Si j'ai bien compris la question, c'est le fait d'amener les systèmes off-grid fait que les sociétés d'électricité perdent un peu de revenus. Est-ce que c'est bien ça la question? Ok. Oui, bien sûr, la production, l'implémentation des systèmes IPP, ok, les producteurs indépendants, nous l'avons déjà introduit au Togo. Nous avons au moins 3 producteurs indépendants qui travaillent avec des puissances au total qui peuvent atteindre plus de 200 mégawatts aujourd'hui. Donc, c'est un système qui nous permet de régler quelques problèmes de financement au niveau de l'État pour pouvoir construire les grandes centrales et on compte sur le secteur privé pour accompagner donc ces producteurs indépendants. Mais également dans le système off-grid, il faut bien dire qu'il y a évidemment les kits que nous voyons, mais on peut avoir aussi un mini-grid qui est utilisé sur la base d'un petit réseau de centrales solaires, ok, et puis les privés pourront intervenir comme ça, construire un petit réseau dans une localité, et alimenter le réseau par une petite centrale solaire et permettre comme ça d'avoir du courant pour ces populations.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Pepin. Pepin Chouate Etu is the Partnerships Coordinator for Power Africa's Empower West Africa program. Pepin, can you talk a little bit about what Power Africa's, well, tell us about what Power Africa's electricity access goals are for West Africa in particular, and how you plan to go about achieving those goals.
Thank you very much, Andy. The Empower West Africa is being financed by the US aid under the Power Africa initiatives. The goals, as far as access is concerned, is about 6 million connections over the next 5 years across the 18 countries that we are covering.
So that's 30 million people.
That's 30 million people, yes. And how do we want to achieve this? We want to achieve this by partnering with different existing programs, upcoming programs, supporting DFIs, defining also or guiding them to define new projects, and that's how we collaborate with major DFIs, but also supporting private companies who are in the off-grid sector on how to improve their performances, how to raise capital, where to find sharing information with them on where there are funding opportunities, and also supporting those who are in the deep rural areas doing productive use of energy. We have also a goal of about 40,000 systems across cooling devices, across pumping, solar pumping devices, and most of these cannot really be implemented if there is no really substantial financing system across that. And then we also working with the banking and financial sector to support them, help them understand the off-grid businesses, and thereby define also specific financial products in order to encourage the deployment of off-grid systems. Mais de l'autre côté aussi, il y en a besoin du gouvernement, parce que toutes ces entreprises rencontrent des difficultés sur le terrain, et certaines de ces difficultés sont liées au cadre réglementaire, ce qui fait que notre programme va aussi, en recevant toutes les informations du secteur privé, remonter l'information au niveau du gouvernement et appuyer la mise en place de nouveaux cadres réglementaires qui favorisent l'investissement du secteur privé. Dans beaucoup de pays aujourd'hui, les entreprises sont encore obligées de payer des taxes d'importation et aussi de la TVA sur des matériels solaires ou bien des matériels équipements énergie renouvelable en général. Et nous venons d'écouter de plusieurs intervenants sur la notion du prix et la capacité des populations rurales visées à payer. Donc, un État qui fait déjà l'effort de surseoir à ses coûts de tarifs douaniers et aux coûts de taxes permet le plus souvent de réduire déjà le prix du produit final de plus de 40%, et dans certains pays, ça peut atteindre 50%, ce qui rapproche encore le produit du consommateur.
Thanks so much, Pepin. All right, I'm going to turn to Jeff Felton, who's the Director of Africa Consulting for GreenMax Capital Advisors. Just again, give us another private sector perspective, but you're also an implementer for a lot of these public programs as well. it's your view that subsidies are critical for scaling the distributed renewable energy sector. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about why you see, what those subsidies need to look like, and can they be structured in a way that's sustainable in the long run? Like, is it always going to be subsidies, or do you see a sunset period for subsidies? And why has the distributed renewable energy sector struggled to attract investment, particularly equity investment?
Okay, thank you, Andy, for the question. So GreenMax is a consulting firm, but also a fund manager. And most of the funds that we manage are subsidy funds financed by the World Bank or the African Development Bank. Alex used the expression blended finance. I don't know if outside of Africa anybody uses that expression. Usually globally, businesses are financed by equity and debt. 30% equity, 70% debt. But in our sector here, distributed renewable energy, subsidies sometimes rise to 50% of the investment. And still, with that huge amount of subsidies, the equity and debt doesn't come.
Well, do the subsidies prevent the equity and debt from coming in?
No.
Is it seen as like a black mark on the
Actually,
project?
sometimes the subsidies disappear because the debt and the equity hasn't appeared. And what, these investors, some of are out there in the audience here, equity investors and debt investors, they're smart people. And they look at these projects and they say, well, this doesn't look very profitable to me.
Well,
right?
if it's being subsidized, it doesn't look very profitable, right?
Okay, so you take for example a company that sells solar home systems. Tier 1, the cheapest solar home system might cost you $110, right? And the margin on that system for the company might be $15. So you sell 1,000 of them, and you've earned $15,000. You've sold 1,000 of them, and you've earned $15,000, which is, and then you've sold those on credit, so you got to go around for the next 18 months, 24 months, getting $5 per household for the next 2 years. That's not a very interesting business. And the same thing for mini grids. A very efficient mini grid company could connect a household or a customer for $750, right? But more often than not, it's going to cost $1,000 or more. So the subsidy comes in and says, okay, you connect this household, we'll give you $600, right? So then the cost of the connection drops to $400, right? But that household you just connected is only going to spend $4 a month on electricity. So you need 100 months to recover the connection costs. So these investors, these equity and debt investors, they're not dumb people. They look at that and they say, well, this doesn't look very interesting to me. But,
So how do you make it interesting?
So here you go.
You already talked about it's already being subsidized and it's still not interesting.
Yeah,
It's going to take
so
you 100 months to make any money.
The people that are behind these companies, the entrepreneurs, they're also smart people. So like this guy, they're coming up with different business models, right? And for solar home systems, if you think you're going to just sell $110 systems over and over and over again and get rich, you're not. You have to diversify, and you have to install C&I systems. You have to install productive use equipment. You have to sell irrigation.
But if you're a business, why do you need to even do
diversify.
off-grid at all then? Why don't you just only do C&I where you're going to make money?
Yeah, well,
So why even be in the business of,
Okay,
of
and the
solar
same
home
thing for
systems?
mini grids, right? If you're just selling to these households at $4 a month, you're never going to make it. So you need the health clinic, you need the private school, you need the village mill, you need the what they call the productive use clients or the anchor clients. So the companies are finding ways to make their business models more profitable.
Whose responsibility is it to cover these subsidies, in your opinion?
I can only see the DFIs doing that, and you know, in addition to what I do for GreenMax in its consulting group, I also manage the Mwinda Fund in the DRC Congo, which is a World Bank funded and hopefully eventually an African Development Bank funded subsidy program for mini grids and solar home systems. And you know, we're gonna slap $55 subsidy on a solar home system. So instead of $110, it's going to be $55. So then it's easier for the company to recuperate its money. Same thing for mini grids. We're going to slap $600 on a connection, but still, that doesn't remove the company's, the entrepreneur's responsibility to think outside the box and make his business more interesting.
So a bunch of people want to jump in on this. I guess Tomas is shaking his head, and Alex wants to talk. So why don't we go to Alex first, and then to Tomas, and then Jan also.
Okay. Just want to respond briefly to the question you posed to a former minister from Benin about the defection of customers from the grid. I just returned from a conference in Cape Town where the subject matter was a big subject because ESCOM in South Africa is facing such a challenge because of the rolling blackouts in South Africa. Most big customers who are big clients of ESCOM are now reverting to self-generation. And ESCOM is losing these people. But they still maintain the ESCOM grid as a fallback for times when their solar panels or their self-generation is not working. Meanwhile,
Do they have to pay ESCOM any sort of capacity charge?
that is the point. Because anytime they want to revert to the grid, they can come to the grid. Meanwhile, the payment for fixed charges on the ESCOM's infrastructure is built into the tariff, where the ordinary man is paying everyday tariffs and paying for fixed costs of the assets. But the self-generator who reverts to the grid in times of stress is not paying for the ESCOM's fixed costs. So now they are calling on the regulator to revise the tariffs for such customers.
So I'm going to say I told you so on this one. I made this call about 8 years ago when I was at Power Africa, and I said to my team, I said, we should allow companies to self-generate, but make them pay the utility a small fee in order to be able to do that.
Precisely.
And that way the utility can use that. Like if the utility is charging 14 cents per kilowatt hour and you can produce power for your own for 8 cents,
Yes.
pay the utility 2 cents.
Yes.
And it's still better for you, but it then helps the utility do everything that it needs to do. I said this
Precisely.
years ago.
Precisely.
And my team's like, no, that would never work, that would never work. And
That's what they are talking about in South Africa right now, where the self-generators would have to find a way of paying for the fixed cost of the assets that they revert to.
I mean, I called it almost like the Uberization of power generation, where eventually you say, everyone can produce your own power, but you've got to pay this utility a certain nominal amount of money so that it can provide all the services that it needs, the basic service to everybody else, something like that. That's the direction where I feel like we need to head. But Tomas, you wanted to say something on the previous point, or no?
Sorry, I had a question for you. You know.
Okay.
You
Turning the
asked,
tables. Go
yeah,
ahead.
you asked, you know, who should pay for these subsidies and what's the sunset of these subsidies? When
Yeah.
should they end? Well, okay, let me return the question to you. when is the on-grid subsidy, when are the on-grid subsidies going to end?
Yeah. No, you need cost-reflective tariffs. So, I mean, that we all know that. And that's a big political struggle that everybody deals with everywhere. And as we look at Mission 300, we're entering into compacts. The World Bank and African Development Bank are entering into compacts with countries. And there's also an All-Africa Declaration that's being worked on as well. And it's a very, very sensitive topic. And I think we're being, having to use very broad language that countries agree to work towards, I don't remember the exact language, work towards cost-reflective tariffs over a period of time. In an ideal world, we'd all say, all right, you're going to have, over the next 5 years, you're going to have a cost-reflective tariff. But we've seen how that plays out in countries. Jan, do you want to talk about that at all?
Oh God, don't get me started. Very quickly before I switch to my favorite topic of cost-reflective tariffs, I just wanted to react to what Jeff said on blended finance. I think there's an important detail, an important underlying idea about blended finance, and that is to reduce the transaction cost from the perspective of all the businesses that need to wrap their heads around World Bank RBF programs. Equity provided, well, almost never provided, I mean, hopefully from next year provided by IFC. Certain programs that provide concessional debt, then a little bit of carbon finance here, a little bit of other subsidies there. There's a huge transaction cost to connecting these dots, and also you lose out on a lot of synergy. So for example, one of the smartest way of providing upfront financing for the construction of mini-grids is to collateralize future RBF programs. You can't do that if you don't have a blended finance facility. So this is really, really important. Somebody has to be there and connect the dots and use these sources of financing in a more holistic and more efficient way. Now, cost-reflective tariffs is a tricky topic. I mean, in the grid sector, this basically means we have, the large majority of countries throughout Africa don't have cost-reflective tariffs. And when we speak about tariffs, that's a problem. We speak about cost per kilowatt hour. And if we are honestly thinking about connecting the most vulnerable populations, the biggest factor for them to be included is not the cost per kilowatt hour, it's the connection cost. We had so many examples of countries who were blindly focusing on making the kilowatt hour as cheap as possible, but then charging connection costs of $100 or $200 even for poor households. So the key thing here is to think of electricity services as a service, not in terms of electrons. And if we force mini-grid operators, for example, to apply the same non-cost reflective tariff across the whole country, the péréquation tarifaire, then you create a barrier, the exact same barrier of sustainability for the DRE, for the off-grid sector. So we need to be able to have an open conversation about what's a more efficient and smarter way of pricing. And so AFDB is already pioneering a very smart concept, which is minimum subsidy tenders, which is finally, instead of second-guessing subsidy levels, find out what the willingness to pay actually is, and find out at what price, if you really have competition, mini-grid operators can provide the kilowatt hour instead of second-guessing a tariff and then subsidizing as a function of that. That's really approaching the problem from the wrong way.
I'm going to give Oliver a chance to speak because you opened us up. We haven't asked you any questions yet. But what role do you see GOGLA playing in helping Mission 300 achieve its goals?
Sure. I think we'd like to be seen as a resource. I think M300 is already showing huge potential in catalyzing everything. We've heard a lot from Power Africa, from the bank. There's a lot of the solutions that are out there around blended finance, around TA, around capacity building for local banks. We need local currency financing. Business model innovation, as mentioned by Thomas. I feel like a lot of the pieces that we're missing are kind of there, or we've seen innovation on these different pieces of the puzzle. And I think M300 has a huge opportunity to kind of break down the barriers and speed up the scale at which all these things can come together and help these companies, the private sector, essentially play this service role to rural populations, which by definition is not a profitable endeavor. And we're asking companies to be profitable while doing it. And I think Jeff was right, like diversification is key. There's a responsibility of the entrepreneurs to kind of play that role. But it's also, this kind of bringing all these pieces together is, I think, where we help M300 could play a role. And as GOGLA, I think, we'd like to be a resource for you, for the bank, for AFDB, but also for governments. I think there's, one of the things we haven't talked about is we'll talk about grid versus mini-grid or mini-grid versus off-grid, and let's say pay-as-you-go versus energy as a service. There's a segmentation question, right? If we want to use public money efficiently, we also need to figure out who's best reached by what type of model, what type of subsidy level, so that we're also using this public money in the most efficient way.
Thank you. I want to make sure we've got 5 minutes left to take any questions from the audience. Does anyone from the audience have anything that they want to ask? Yes, we have a hand in the back. And please identify yourself.
Thank you very much for the discussions. My question is to the representative of African Development Bank. I was curious to hear about, I was curious to hear more on the question referring to how and what the bank has been doing differently. And I still need your clarification on that point, because when I have a look, for example, at the Sustainable Energy Facility for Africa, I see that there has been a certain change, because initially it was a pure grant model, and it was very, it was really matching the needs of investors on the continent. And the new change in the CFA model, I'm just questioning, I'm just wondering whether that could be a progress in the context of the risk perception of African markets. How do you see that CFA new model as a catalytic tool for, attracting investment on the continent? That's the first question. The second one is related to the solvability of public utilities. I just want to hear from you on your ideas and propositions on how those utilities on the continent could be made much more profitable. At the bank level, is there any magic solution on that?
I think we can direct that to Alex, but also to Damipi probably as well, to talk about utility solvency. So Alex, do you want to go first?
I'm not sure of what you mean by the CFA new model. As much as I remember, I think solar is still a grant facility, and most of the money we give to countries are grant financing. Blended.
They expanded from grants to blended finance, and now they can give loans, they can do guarantees.
Okay, so I'm being corrected here that CFA is now blending it, so they can give loans as well. Anything as well as grants. Yes, so what has changed with CFA is that their capital base has increased. The last call for capital revitalization, I think they made, I've forgotten the figure, but CFA funds are now bigger funds. They can do more than they used to do in the past. Before he comes in on the sustainability of the utilities, the bank has a program called the SUT, Sustainable Utilities for Africa, and we are working with APOA, African Power Utilities agencies, to see how we can help utilities improve their performance. Most utilities on the continent are struggling with challenges such as high losses, poor collection rates, and poor tariffs. We've talked about the tariff levels not being competitive enough. So the bank is helping African utilities and to see how can we make these utilities more sustainable, because with the talk about private sector coming into the power sector, most of the private sectors who come in, particularly IPPs with generation, they are looking for credible off-takers. And if we can improve access, we need to increase generation. And if we can increase generation from the private sector angle, private sector generators need more credible off-takers in existing utilities. So we need to work on our utilities to be more financially viable, so that private sectors, participants who are coming in to do production of electricity can find partners, off-taker partners in the utilities to be able to take their power and also be able to pay for the power that they take. Because oftentimes, I come from Ghana, and most of the we have a lot of IPPs in Ghana. Most of the IPPs are owed several millions of dollars by the off-taker, often the electricity company of Ghana. So unless we're able to make our off-takers viable, we discourage the private sector from coming, because when they produce, the off-takers cannot pay.
Tamipi, did you want to address this question at all, either about what needs to be done to improve the financial viability of utilities on the continent?
Oui, merci beaucoup pour la question. En fait, la question était destinée aux bailleurs de savoir qu'est-ce qu'ils entendent, qu'est-ce qu'une société pour eux doit faire pour bien gérer la société. Je pense qu'il y a deux aspects lorsque nous gérons nos sociétés d'électricité. Il y a le fait que nous sommes dans un secteur où nous ne fixons pas le prix, donc les prix sont fixés par les pouvoirs publics. La première question est de savoir si les prix qui sont fixés couvrent effectivement mes charges. Et l'autre question, est-ce que mes charges ne sont pas très élevées? Et donc, il faut d'abord avoir des indicateurs tels que le taux de perte, tels que le prix ou le coût de la main-d'œuvre, les entretiens, etc. Si vous avez des taux de perte de 30%, de 35%, il est évident qu'aucun pouvoir public ne vous donnera l'argent pour aller payer des pertes. Donc, au niveau de la société, ça fait objet de bonne gestion, d'organisation pour réduire ces charges-là dans des proportions qui sont connues sur le plan international. On connaît les taux qu'il faut pour aussi bien l'entretien, pour les pertes, etc. Dans ces pertes, on a les pertes techniques, on a un peu d'action là-dessus, mais il y a aussi beaucoup de pertes non techniques que nous constatons. Donc, il faut lutter contre ces pertes-là. Une fois que la société, je dirais, bien gérée sur ces plans-là, la question est de savoir si les pouvoirs publics me donnent suffisamment de ressources pour couvrir les charges. Donc, voilà ce qui peut arriver dans une société où on n'a pas, la société a des pertes financières. Donc, il faut vraiment regarder. Donc, au niveau de ça, des réformes sont nécessaires dans nos sociétés. La comptabilité analytique doit être bien faite pour déterminer exactement dans quel secteur j'ai des difficultés, dans quel secteur je n'arrive pas à respecter les taux et lutter contre ces mauvaises gestions dans ces secteurs-là. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Pepin?
Yes, thank you, Andy. The question of cost-reflective tariff and utilities, if we really limit ourselves on the utility, there is one thing that I called the illusion of the electricity tariff. Many governments just decide to block the tariff at a certain level. But when we look at the realities, each household, even the poorest connected household in LOME, is losing maybe $5 to $10 monthly just because they don't have reliable electricity services. An example is you can't buy, they are forced to buy, let's say, all fish, all fresh fish, meat, they can't buy in bulk to benefit from a reduction of tariff. They can, just because they don't have reliable services. When you cost all the expenses that they are incurring because there is no reliable services, this is something that is high. So just imagine if they could pay this $5 to $10 directly to the utility through a tariff increase, they will not get poorer, but because they will recoup, or it will avoid them losing that money, but the utility will have more income and be able to provide a better service. So to me, I think this is something that needs to really be taught by, at the government level about the illusion of the low tariff. Thank you.
Thank you. Jan?
This is a really important point, and we just talked about Madagascar before coming here, so let me just give you one example. The poorest and most vulnerable households in Madagascar that live, you know, at the edge of the world, basically, in very remote areas. There was a comparison that we did in terms of their happiness level with electricity services by a certain mini-grid provider that was prevalent in this area. And we compared that with the Jirama customers in Antananarivo, right? So in Antananarivo, you had power cuts, you had connection charges for these poor households before the tariff reform of up to $100, $150. And then they had, once they had access to very unreliable electricity services at a highly subsidized price. If you compare the two, I can guarantee you that mini-grid operators that were paying up to 60 cents per kilowatt hour were much happier customers because they had much more reliable service, they had no connection charge, and they had a mini-grid operator who could actually make a margin on these reliable and sustainable margin based on these tariffs, whereas Jirama is still close to bankruptcy and needs a very huge subsidy package every single month. So tariffs are not only about kilowatt hour, tariffs about having access to electricity services, and this is how we have to think about it.
Thanks. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, very interesting point. And coming back to the question about what you said as well, Andy, like utilities should focus on good clients and leave the most vulnerable ones for like least cost solution like LOME system that are maybe much more efficient. Parce que, let me continue in French, le sujet qu'on a discuté, c'est quand même les sujets de la pauvreté. Qui doit payer pour réduire la pauvreté? C'est ça la question de fond. Parce qu'en fait, les clients qui sont en zone rurale, ici, typiquement, ne peuvent pas payer des grands montants. On parle de 1-2 euros par jour, donc c'est absolument jamais rentable. Pour un acteur privé, c'est pas rentable pour une utility, c'est pas rentable pour une mini-utility. Et du coup, on est au Togo ici, et je pense que ce qu'on peut saluer, c'est le courage politique qu'a eu le Togo. Il n'y en a pas eu dans beaucoup d'endroits où c'est le gouvernement qui paye pour subventionner ce type de programme. Et après, je pense que quand on aura designé des programmes qui seront assez clairs, simples et universels, les gouvernements pourront répliquer ce type de programme et les bailleurs se plieront en quatre et les banques pour les financer. Le problème aujourd'hui, c'est qu'il n'y a pas de vision claire de responsabilité et du coup, la banque va prendre un fund manager qui va mettre 3 ans à sortir un RBF qui globalement va délivrer difficilement. Et si vous étiez là hier, la première ministre l'a quand même dit, on est quand même dans une injustice sociale inacceptable. Il y a 600 millions de personnes qui n'ont pas accès à l'électricité. Il existe des produits qui coûtent moins de $100 qui peuvent apporter déjà un réconfort de préélectrification avant que toute notre intelligence collective arrive à trouver des meilleures solutions. Mais déjà, faisons ça.
Thanks. I want to see, we only have a few minutes left. If there are any other questions from the audience? Yes. Over here. And please identify yourself for everyone.
Okay. So my name is Kingsley Okay. I'm a director for Orwell. Orwell is the biggest, I'll say, indigenous EPC in Nigeria. Speaking about energy access, especially in the off-grid sector, one thing we need is speed. And one thing we've noticed also is the EPCs need some form of project finance. I don't know if any package is available. I know it's kind of blended with the MSTs and the RPGs, but the EPCs need project finance to be able to deploy most of these mini-grid projects in speed. So this question is for you, Andy, AFDB, the World Bank. What package is there for construction finance for the EPCs?
Jan or Alex, you want to take that question?
Generally speaking, our private sector window provide financing for various private sector projects in different sectors, including the energy sector. It depends on the merit of the project. Presently, we are evaluating a proposal from the Lagos state government who wants to do a waste-to-energy project. Okay. If we find the project to be financially viable, obviously they can get loans, private sector loans, commercial loans to develop the project. So the short answer to your question is that yes, private people can attract funding for EPC, for whole-scale projects, but it depends on how we evaluate the project. If we think that the project is viable enough, yes, you can get the money. If it is not viable, it will be treated like any other project.
Yeah, we've been spending a lot of time listening to private companies about what's needed to be successful. So even you talk about with the RBFs, that those are great, but the money comes too late. And so they need working capital loans, and then there's also the question of local currency financing. Jeff, you wanted to say something about this?
Yeah, so we have another fund called CEI Africa, where we subsidize mini-grids, but part of the possibility and package is what we call a forgivable loan. So you can get 30% of the subsidy up front, and once you've built the project and you start connecting customers, that loan transforms into RBF.
So you're just front-loading the RBF.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. One last question from anyone. I saw some hands up over here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Louis Vérin from Mitsumoto. As far as I remember, the first electrification programs...
Can you speak a little bit more loudly?
As far as I remember, the first electrification program I've been studying in the early 21st century were very energy-as-a-service programs. It was often concessions based on exclusive delivery of energy. I'm thinking of Senegal, Morocco in the early 21st century. And then the TOGO technology arrived, and then we entered this rent-to-own dominating model during the 2010s decade. And when I hear Thomas Samuel from Moon, it seems that the industry now is looking back again at more traditional way of traditional model of delivering energy on an energy-as-a-service model. And I was curious to know why do you think it's a question for Moon, also for Google. Why do you think this model is relevant now? And why do you think it's the best model? And what exactly do you mean by energy as a service?
I can start and hand over to Thomas afterwards. So I think there's space for both models. I don't think it's one or the other. I think indeed you're right that there's, because of the public money coming in, I think, as well to the sector for the first time at scale, there's interest again in this kind of energy as a service delivery model. And I think that makes sense given the request for subsidies from the private sector to support electrification. But as I said, I think there's a fundamental question of making sure that we are segmenting the population that we're trying to reach. There are customers that will require this type of public money to be reached, and models like Moon's probably make sense in some contexts. But there are some customers that can be profitably reached by companies with a commercial model, including pay-as-you-go. And it can also be that, I think this is something we've discussed with Thomas in the past, you can have a basic electrification solution that maybe is delivered through this type of publicly funded program. But then if customers want to go one step further in terms of the type of services they have access to, entertainment or just more power capacity, then potentially there's also this question of choice that can be made available through more commercial models. But yeah, Thomas, I'm also curious to hear.
I'm not going to answer it. I'm going to take us to the last question. It's a lightning round for everyone. It's going to determine whether our day ends on a high note or a low note. Okay, I'm going to ask everybody, and I can do the same question tomorrow. Mission 300 panel. Is Mission 300 going to succeed, yes or no? And tell us why. And I'll take volunteers before I just start asking you, unless Alex is reaching for his mic. So we'll go with you first, Alex. Will we succeed, yes or no, and why? Why or how? But like 1 minute or less.
Yes, I think it can succeed. Number one, because the World Bank...
wasn't can, is
the World Bank is involved. The World Bank has a very deep pocket. So it depends on... there are 15 countries involved, and the countries have identified the priority projects that will increase access.
So it's not just... It's every country in sub-Saharan Africa, but
50.
there's some initial compact countries that we're starting with, but there will be others.
The 15 compact countries, they are meeting in Tanzania in January to... the head of state will sign.
That's just the first set.
That's the first set, okay? But I
It's
believe,
important to clarify that because I don't want people walking
Okay,
away thinking
okay.
that they're not.
Okay, so I believe it can succeed because with all the enthusiasm that it has generated, the projects will be better prepared, you know, and with better prepared projects and clarity on the goals that we intend to achieve, it's easier for the financing agencies, the multilaterals and the bilaterals and the private sector to commit to these well-prepared projects. Normally, I think the drawback for most of the private people is because they are not, there's lack of clarity on the projects. With well-prepared projects that have clear goals, I'm sure we will succeed.
Thank you. Jeff, we're just going to go down the line.
I think it can succeed also.
Can. Will it? Everyone's saying can.
Okay, let me say.
I know it can succeed.
It will succeed. I've been learning recently about this IFC permanent equity vehicle.
Platform, yeah.
And, you know, if they succeed in finding 50 companies that they can pump equity into, and debt follows that equity, maybe that'll work.
You think that's a critical enabler? All right, good.
Yeah.
Next, Tomas.
It will dramatically fail if it focuses on grid extension and mini-grid only, and it will greatly succeed if pre-electrification connection, surround system-based, are counted.
But it's not focusing exclusively on grid and...
No,
mini-grid
of course. My answer.
So will it succeed or not?
It shall.
It shall. Aminata?
Ça peut fonctionner uniquement si on a une vision holistique des choses, donc de la production au transport, à la distribution et l'accès. Si on ne couvre pas toute cette chaîne de valeur, je pense que ce sera très compliqué.
Yeah, I don't really have a choice, but to give you an honest opinion...
You better say it will.
Yes, we will succeed, but probably not for the reason that you think we will succeed, because I think M300 is such a big commitment that we will not get away with window dressing. We have to do two things, and we just talked about one thing today, which is reinventing our delivery models. The current delivery models, including the ones of the World Bank, are not technology agnostic, not flexible, and not fast enough. But there's another thing that we won't get away with, is that as World Bank, we won't get away with changing ourselves and changing our own modus operandi. And this is where the World Bank also needs your help in reminding us of that regularly and putting pressure on the organization to really do our homework internally as well.
Japan?
Yes, I would say it will succeed if the necessary business model is put in place in the different countries. And the business model will vary from one country to the other. Some countries are well advanced, have a higher electricity coverage rate. I want really to insist on the coverage rate because some of the access rate that are being given or published are coverage rate. It doesn't really mean that people are connected. But if they have this higher rate, they can have another business model, like giving one could think about cross-subsidization between the grid and the off-grid. Then if that is taken into account, other countries with lower coverage rate will also need another. So I think that for M300 to really succeed, they should have this also a part of this technical assistance to support countries find their specific and tailored business model that will help in your countries. That will be my point of that. Thank you.
Oui, je pense que le projet doit réussir parce qu'il y a la vision, il y a la volonté politique. Donc, ce qui nous reste, c'est les techniciens doivent travailler. Par technicien, j'entends évidemment les vrais techniciens, les financiers, les juristes. Nous devons tous travailler pour faire réussir ce projet. Dans tous les cas, on n'a pas le choix. On doit apporter l'électricité à toute la population d'une manière ou d'une autre. Ce projet doit réussir. Merci.
Je vais me permettre de le faire en français cette fois-ci aussi. Je pense qu'effectivement, on va réussir pour une raison simple, c'est que je pense qu'il y a énormément d'innovations qui ont été portées ces dernières années. On a énormément appris. Et là, avec le projet M300, ça va être l'occasion d'amener toutes ces innovations et toutes ces leçons apprises à échelle, enfin.
Okay, I'm going to finish by saying it will succeed for a couple of reasons that haven't been mentioned. Number one, we've learned so much over the last 10, 15 years about the sector that that's not like we're starting from square one. We have an idea of what works, what doesn't work, and people are being open about that. Number two, don't underestimate the role that AI is going to play in number one, helping us do planning, but also the demand that's being created for electricity in areas that, you know, there are going to be new income streams that didn't exist before. You've got e-mobility, you've got data learning, you've got data storage, all of these things which can be decentralized. You even have cryptocurrency mining, that there's demand for that. So there's additional potential income streams for off-grid electricity that we haven't even thought about. You look in a lot of the US and elsewhere in the world, data storage itself is becoming the #1 consumer of electricity. So, and that can happen from anywhere in the world. So there are going to be ways to further supplement and subsidize energy access that we haven't even thought through and we haven't even talked about at all. I think the market's going to change very, very rapidly, but the key is we've got the absolute best people in the world across all the organizations working on this and working on it for the right reasons. They're doing it because they want to see it succeed. So thanks to all of you for what you're doing, and thanks to everybody in the audience for what you're doing to advance this important initiative.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Avant la séance photo, juste un petit rappel. You're gonna have to take a picture, sorry. Juste un petit rappel en parlant de mission M300. Demain, la session commencera à 8h15, s'il vous plaît, de la Banque mondiale. Ça sera ici, dans cette salle. Merci beaucoup et bonne soirée à tout le monde.
Ha ha ha!